If you're here, I'm thinking that you most likely believe in some way that solid critical thinking skills are must for your child to succeed in science class. The more advanced the class, the more this is true, but critical thinking skills are really necessary for students to understand science at any level. If you're still not fully convinced of this, I have a previous video about why critical thinking skills are so necessary in science. But in this video, I'll focus on strategies your child can use to actually build their critical thinking skills. The first thing they can do to begin to amp up those critical thinking skills is to ask questions. Science doesn't go anywhere without an innate curiosity about how the world works, so an easy starting point is by asking questions about what we observe in our world. This causes us to ignore our screens for a minute and notice and pay attention to what is actually going on right in front of us. Right away, this causes us to focus and think and wonder about why things are the way they are. This curiosity is the starting point for critical thinking. Once your child is starting to ask questions, guide them in the questions they're asking. Are they yes or no questions, one-word answers, or are they questions that require an explanation? When you talk to little kids, one of their favorite questions is why. Personally, I both love and hate when my own young kids ask this. I hate it because I don't always have the time, energy, or patience to answer, and that's even assuming I know the answer. But I love it because it means my children are being curious, wondering about the world, and taking the initiative to ask about it so that they can learn something. In my Science Skills Accelerator course, I go into depth about how to help your child build their curiosity muscle so that this becomes a habit again, like when they were young. But beyond just curiosity, make sure your child starts asking questions that require a conversation or explanation. I know, tricky with teenagers, but try. An easy way to ensure that is to have the questions start with why or how. And that's a perfect start. The next thing students need to be able to do to be a critical thinker is analyze what they have in front of them to actually begin to answer the questions they're asking. Or maybe this step comes in when they have a question from their teacher or the class material itself. This is a big step, and I believe that analyzing data is not a skill students are explicitly taught in school. As their classes get more advanced, teachers begin expecting kids to just kind of do it. Some kids sort of figure it out, but many don't and begin falling behind right here. So this is where you need to make sure they don't fall behind the wagon and fall off the wagon, sorry. Encourage your child to think about what they already know that is related to what is in front of them. There are two avenues to go down here. The first is to relate their question or material to everyday life. If this is possible, then it's a great option because it grounds the students in their learning and gives them a way to relate to the science. A large body of research and education says that we remember and learn material better if we can build on what we already know. But what if the topic is not something that relates to, or at least easily relates to, our everyday world? There are a lot of concepts in science, especially as it gets more advanced, that are more abstract. So this can be more difficult to do. This is where they can lean on any prior knowledge to the topic or question. It might not be a lot of prior knowledge or just loosely connected, but we're looking for any information that they already know that will help them build in this new concept. Is there anything from a previous science class that they remember that could be helpful? Maybe it's even from another course or something they've seen or learned outside school. They're like a detective here looking for clues that will help them build a connection that makes sense for them. It doesn't have to help anybody else learn. It can be personal to them. In this way, they begin to make the connections and incorporate the new material into what they already know. And this is how they learn. Another strong and very specific way to build on students' prior knowledge is to look for patterns. Phases of the moon is an obvious example where patterns are present in science. By noticing how the phases of the moon change, students can begin to ask and then learn why we see the moon differently on different nights. If they can notice the pattern first themselves, it gives them ownership over figuring out how and why the pattern works. In the phases of the moon example, they can get into why they see the entire moon one night, pieces of the moon another night, and still no moon on another night. It doesn't work with all content, and this particular example is really clear-cut to illustrate my point, but when it does, it unlocks a truly powerful way to build critical thinking skills in science class. Inside the Science Skills Accelerator course, I teach exactly how to use prior knowledge to build critical thinking skills with content from science class. Once students have learned to find the connections from their prior knowledge, it's time to use evidence to support their thoughts. This requires students to turn their attention to everything in front of them, including their prior knowledge. Here they think about an answer to their question or the question put in front of the class. Before they walk away just accepting their answer, they use what they know to prove or disprove their answer. They have to think through why they're giving that answer. What evidence is pointing to it being correct? It's just like the detective again. The detective thinks they know who did it, but they need the evidence to evaluate if their idea is indeed correct. For your child, they can ask themselves, is there something I noticed in the material that points me in the direction of my answer? Is there something I've learned before that backs up my idea? Could it be both? Is there any evidence of a pattern? These are all questions students might briefly think about naturally as individual thoughts or questions, but when they think about them intentionally and together, now they're using and building their critical thinking skills. All of these questions as students are evaluating evidence brings me to my next point as far as building critical thinking skills goes. Having an open mind and being reflective when going through this process. Maybe they think they've answered the question, but there's no evidence to really support it. Using the evidence or prior knowledge to go back to square one is frustrating, but it certainly builds those critical thinking skills. Another thing that could easily happen to detectives on a case. Or maybe for your child going through this process, someone else has another idea. Being able to listen to other ideas and evaluate whether they fit with yours helps you learn and grow your own critical thinking skills. Okay, so that was a lot. Let's summarize the strategies your child can use to focus on building their all-important critical thinking skills in science. The first is to ask good questions as a way of being curious about the material and possible answers. The second strategy is for them to use what they already know or have learned to build on so that they can learn and assimilate the new information. The third strategy is to look for evidence to help them form explanations that can possibly answer a question they're asking or being asked. And finally, if they can be open-minded and reflective, it helps open their eyes to whether or not their answers make sense. These strategies work in tandem with each other like a detective solving a case. They're not necessarily done one after the other in order, but can be more like a cycle that can continue to start over. I am not suggesting that students have the time or energy to do this every single time they're presented with a problem in class. I am suggesting, however, that they choose places in their curriculum where they can begin to use and practice this process. I'm very big on using and practicing to form something that becomes second nature or at least more of a habit. It might not happen overnight, but this process of building critical thinking skills will help your student be a more successful science student. I give a step-by-step process along with examples and practice that helps students know exactly what to do to build these important critical thinking skills in my online course, Science Skills Accelerator. I also make YouTube videos as a resource to help parents become more aware of how they can help their children with science. My next video will explain why schools aren't really teaching your child critical thinking skills and why it's necessary for them to develop them on their own if they want to be truly successful in science. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to seeing more of you soon.